Howdy, y'all. So, I did a breakdown about 2 weeks ago of the various nations in World of Warships, and I was told that this might be a good video to have on YouTube. Obviously, cutting from the VOD doesn't exactly lend to particularly perfect output in terms of content, so I decided that we were going to go ahead and try to record a standalone YouTube video, essentially breaking down the very basics in World of Warships and what the difference in the nations are. I say very basics because there's always ships that break this norm, whether they're premium ships or specific ships in the tech tree. I'm going to give you a very basic beginner's guide to what the differences between each nation actually is. It should be understood that there may be differing opinions or ideas for this, but this is meant to be somebody brand new that comes to World of Warships. They could look at this video as a good starting point. On a side note, I believe that it is time for me to start producing more YouTube content, and I'm going to attempt to put out at least one video every week. If you have ideas for things you might like to see on YouTube, definitely ask me or tell me in the comments, or send me a DM on Discord. Both the information is on the About page here on the YouTube channel. I appreciate you guys watching. Let's get started. So the first nation you're going to see here in World of Warships at the very top is Japan. You're going to see a battleship line here. You're going to see a cruiser line, 2 destroyer lines, and an aircraft carrier line. To be clear, typically what I tell anyone new to World of Warships is start with battleships first. Battleships are probably some of the best classes of ships that you could play to try to learn how to play the game. They aren't exactly fast, so you're not going to get into trouble extremely fast. They tend to be a little bit more forgiving if you do make a mistake, and they have the ability to repair back damage from the very first battleship, which is pretty darn important if you make that mistake. As for the IJN, or Imperial Japanese Navy, these ships are essentially a little bit faster than other ships in the class. They are meant to be essentially glass cannons. A lot of the guns on these ships are going to be very good. They're going to be typically meant for longer range engagements, and they're going to be meant for placement a little bit further back than you might normally play in any other nation. The Japanese battleships, first of all, we're talking about Tier 3, Tier 4, Tier 5, Tier 6, Tier 7, and Tier 8. These are really where they were from the dreadnoughts up to battle cruisers. They are typically a little bit faster, but have significantly longer gun range than their counterparts typically at tier. They aren't going to be the best armored ships as a result of that. They are meant to be sitting back a little bit further. Again, these are the basics. You're going to have differing opinions coming from various people talking about how battleships should be played, but at the beginning when you're learning mechanics, this is good. At Tier 9, Tier 10, and super ships, or Tier 11, is where the Japanese battleships really become battleships. They have significantly better significantly better armor than their earlier counterparts, significantly punchier guns, and in general, they just become really what you'd think a battleship should probably be. Not bad dispersion either. These are typically pretty fun battleships to play. When the game first released, the Izumo was not a joy to play. I will tell you right now, the Izumo is not that bad now. It's actually, as for a Tier 9 tech tree ship, it's pretty darn good. The Japanese cruisers typically are going to have higher than normal caliber guns. They are really good for fairly long range HE spamming. What do I mean by that? HE is high explosive. It has the ability to start fires, not just deal damage shell for shell. This is really good, especially if you have support on a flank. When you get up to, I would even beg to say the Aoba and up, the guns are pretty high caliber for their tier and will do pretty good damage by themselves without HE spamming. Again, these are glass cannons. Typically, if you start getting shot at by even comparable class cruisers and tier, you're going to start taking significant damage because they tend to be lower armor. When you get to the Mogami, the Ibuki, and the Zao, you're mounting some of the largest caliber guns that you could find on these cruisers, which is really good against just about any foe, assuming that you know how to kite or fire over your shoulder and while you're running, essentially running and gunning. When you look at the IGN destroyer line, you're going to see a split off that happens at tier 4. Okay, and the line continues down to the Shimakaze or Yamagiri and breaks off and goes down to Harugumo, or breaks off and goes to the carriers. What this line split is, the difference between the Shimakaze and the Harugumo lines is torp focus versus gun focus. Okay, now realistically, this gun focus slash torp focus doesn't really show itself until about tier 8. However, that's the differences between the line. The Minakaze, Matsuki, Fubuki, Hatsuhara, Aket, Shiratsuyu can play very similarly in that they probably should be played more as torp boats, and the guns should be an afterthought or used at a point where you come across another destroyer at close range and you need to defend yourself. That being said, Japanese guns are very punchy on the torp boats, all the way up to Shimakaze. They deal massive damage for the caliber guns that they have, but that is balanced by a slow reload and slow turret traverse, which can be quite painful. So if you go up the Shima line, you should understand that you're meant to use your stealth and long-range torps to keep the enemy spotted and either spam torps in the direction that you know enemies are headed, or do area denial with your torps in areas you know destroyers may cross through, right? Akazuki, Kitakaze, and Harugumo. These ships really play completely different than the rest of the Japanese destroyer line. They have 100mm guns that are very high rate of fire, that actually have improved damage compared, or they have the ability to do more damage than the average 100mm gun across the board. As a result, Akazuki, Kitakaze, and Harugumo are very good at 1v1 against other destroyers. Now, that being said, the Harugumo itself plays a little bit different than the Kitakaze. Kitakaze and Akazuki are not the fastest and most agile destroyers, but the Harugumo is significantly less agile, maneuverable, and agile in terms of acceleration, deceleration. So that's something that you need to think about if you go up these lines. If you like high-speed, low-drag, stealthy ships, realistically the Shimakaze is a better pick. However, if you're somebody that likes to send a lot of ordnance downrange and scare the bejesus out of a battleship that you might be shooting at, the Harugumo, Kitakaze, and Akazuki might be up your lane. Now, that being said, we're on to IGN carriers. You won't hear me talk too much about carriers because, in my opinion, if you're a new player coming to the game, carriers and even destroyers, in my opinion, should be the last classes that you look at playing until you get a grasp of basic mechanics in the game. Reason I say that is you're going to see a lot of people playing at even high tiers, at tier 10, and they don't necessarily understand how to play the game. This, unfortunately, is more common than you might think, simply because it is not particularly hard to go up the tiers in this game just by playing it, not particularly having skill. Okay, so Japanese carriers, they have some of the punchiest torpedo bombers in the game and some of the best hard-hitting AP bombs that you're going to see in the game as well. Their aircraft tend to be a little bit squishy, however, and their carriers tend to be a little bit more stealthy. That's a very loose explanation. When I say they're more stealthy, it doesn't mean like they can't get spotted very easily. They, compared to other carrier lines, they have pretty good concealment. But again, we're not going to spend too much time on the carrier lines. The point of this was to discuss the differences between the nations. So here we go. On to the USA. So with the United States, these ships, the American ships, are what I typically say the jack of all trades, master of none class. They don't particularly do one thing great. They kind of do everything fairly well. Now, I will tell you, starting at the American battleship lines and going all the way up the Vermont line, this battleship line is some of the slowest, least maneuverable battleships that you'll probably play in the game. But there is a however in that description. They have some of the more harder hitting guns for the class, especially when you get near the Colorado, Kansas, Minnesota, and Vermont. These ships are not fast, but they have very punchy guns that can deal pretty high amounts of damage at longer ranges. Assuming you get good at leading targets, you get good at knowing where you want to place your ordnance on the target, you could do very, very good in these ships. They have pretty fast reload to their repair party and damage control. Like I said, again, they aren't particularly a master of anything specific, but they are pretty good generally in terms of a class of battleships. North Carolina, Iowa, and Montana. These ships are fairly maneuverable, have pretty good top speeds, and they have very good guns. For me personally, the Montana is probably my favorite Tier 10 battleship in the game. Just because you have, 12 16-inch guns that you're able to bring onto a target and at quite a bit of angle forward or aft. She's pretty fast. She's got pretty good anti-aircraft coverage, not bad armor, etc., etc. But again, they don't necessarily do anything the best. They are just better all around. Okay. The American light cruiser line and the American heavy cruiser line. Americans basically classify the differences between American heavy and American light cruisers looking at the caliber of their guns. The armor doesn't particularly play a lot in terms of delineating these two splits. When you're going up the line, anybody that's played American cruisers know that all the way up to the Omaha, these ships can get wrecked pretty easily. They teach you very good lessons when you make mistakes on your positioning, because they sit pretty high in the water. They don't have a whole lot of armor, but they have pretty good guns with a pretty good rate of fire. So if you're pretty good at maneuvering and positioning, they can do fairly well. When you get to the Dallas, the difference between the Dallas and the Pensacola at Tier 6 is pretty stark. The Dallas is fairly small, has a pretty good amount of guns, fairly good AA, and actually pretty maneuverable for the tier. That being said, again, she is super squishy. If you make mistakes, you will know it. The Pensacola has some of the best guns at Tier 6 that you could find on a cruiser, but they are very slow reloading, and the turret traverse on them is atrocious. So you have to think ahead in terms of how you want to position your ship, looking at the enemy, what have you, before you go to engage, because if you need a turn, your guns aren't going to stay on target. Okay, this is continued to the New Orleans, And the turret traverse improves with the Baltimore Buffalo and even more so with the Des Moines. The guns for the class are probably some of the best you may find in the game, though. I will say that. The caliber guns on the U.S. heavy cruiser line are probably some of the best guns, and if you get good with the American heavy cruisers, there's pretty much any cruiser in the game you could do significantly better in, just because these cruisers will teach you when you make mistakes, so you tend to be a little bit more careful over time. Helena, Cleveland, Seattle. Higher rate of fire, lower caliber guns, very light armor. With the Helena specifically, you have more guns than you have on the Dallas, but she is a longer ship, which means she's a bigger target, so you have to be a lot more careful. And her gun range, unfortunately, suffers as a result of that as well. The Cleveland and Seattle play very similarly. However, the Seattle starts getting a little bit better armor. The Worcester or Worcester is probably one of the better cruisers for holding a flank, assuming you have support. If she is left by herself, she can be punished pretty brutally to someone that is learning still how to play cruisers. Now, that being said, at tier 10, we shouldn't be learning how to play cruisers, okay? This should be occurring at tier 6, tier 7, and below. This is why I also try to tell people don't hurry up the lines, right? The American destroyers, I will tell you, if you can get good in an American destroyer, you can play probably any destroyer in the game fairly well. There are going to, of course, be a few differences in the nations, and we'll get onto those as we go down the line. But because these destroyers don't particularly have the best concealment, they don't particularly have the best guns, especially when you consider that the American 5-inch guns on these destroyers pretty much are the same guns from tier 5 all the way up to tier 10. You just have more of them, so their performance is not great, right? There's no real improvement in those guns all the way up the line. They tend to have extremely floaty shells, which means you fire it, and at max range, that shell stays up in the air for a very long time before coming down. This makes it very difficult to guess your aim on a target. And even the gearing that has had pretty good buffs over the last couple patches is still, in my opinion, one of the worst tier 10 destroyers in the game. Especially if you're learning how to play destroyers. Now, that being said, there's going to be people out there that love the gearing, that love the Fletcher, love the Benson. I totally get that. I personally think the Fletcher is a better destroyer than the gearing. However, there are other destroyers in the game at those tiers that, in my opinion, can just perform better. So it's just something to think about. The ships can, in the hands of a skilled driver, do very well. Its torps do fairly good amounts of damage for the reload. The anti-aircraft coverage is pretty good. The concealment is very good. We're not going to get into the UU or unique upgrades that are in the game that change how to play these ships. That'll be at a later video, but these things can all change how these ships perform, tier 10 specifically. But yeah, the U.S. destroyers are probably mediocre in terms of performance overall. American carriers, I will tell you, the Langley and the Ranger are probably two of the hardest carriers to get really good at because they don't particularly do, again, anything great. When you get to the Lexington and the Midway is when the U.S. carriers start performing fairly good, specifically in their bombers and their damage that they can output with their HE bombers and even their torps. The torp spread that the American carriers have is actually pretty good for ensuring tick damage. But again, we aren't going to get too much into the carriers specifically. If you're a new player to World of Warships, I want you to focus on battleships first, cruisers next, and so on and so forth. And again, I'm not trying to play down a specific nation or anything like that, but there are ways that these ships should be played. And so I'm trying to give you kind of the basics in terms of what you should expect. USSR, the Soviet tech tree. You'll see a battleship line, a light cruiser line, heavy cruiser line, and then 2 destroyer lines and a carrier line. Starting with the battleships. These Soviet battleships have some of the punchiest, most accurate guns probably in the game. They have very good armor, they have very good gun range. Now that being said, they have limited damage control consumables. What does that mean? If you're a battleship and you have 4 damage controls in the course of a battle, you use those 4, and they're gone. If somebody starts a fire on you or a flood, it's going to stay put on you throughout the entire length of fire or flood. The Soviet battleships are pretty good for tanking because of the fact that their damage control, though limited in number, has some of the shortest cooldown between damage controls. Now that doesn't mean that you should go in pushing point blank and tanking with these ships. These battleships, in my opinion, should probably be some of the last nation's battleships that you take a look at, simply because of the fact that you have to have pretty good consumable management on these ships, knowing when to hit your repair party, damage control, etc., knowing mechanics, knowing gun angles, what angle to the enemy you're going to take damage versus being able to deflect it, right? Pretty good anti-aircraft coverage, pretty good armor, punchy guns, pretty accurate guns. I will be honest with you, I don't care for the Soviet battleship line. I don't like having limited numbers of damage control consumables. That's just me. That's just how I play. I tend to try to make sure my battleship lasts as long as possible, and as a result, having limited damage control can limit my ability to do that, so I don't care for it. The Soviet carrier lines, and actually I forgot to mention the fact that the Japanese cruisers do not have radar. They have the ability to mount hydro, which detects only torpedoes or ships in smoke if you're close enough. The US cruisers have radar, starting at the Cleveland and Baltimore and going up to the top tiers. You can demount the radar and swap it out for a spotting aircraft with some. Please don't do that. Your radar is probably your most valuable asset for these higher tier ships for you and your team. Okay. Typically, depending on the radars you look at, if you look at case in point, the Cleveland, its radar, you're looking at 9 kilometer ship detection range, and it should be the same if I go here. 10 kilometer for the Baltimore. This stays pretty true all the way through to the top. When you get, and a lot of these will change over time just because of balancing. 10 kilometer with the Des Moines, and you look at the Worcester, her radar is at 9 kilometers. Now the differences between this, and we'll discuss this when we go down the line, is how long the radar lasts. But let's look at the USSR, okay? When you look at the very first ship that you can mount a radar on, the Chapiev in the tech tree, 12 kilometer radar, okay? So you have 2 extra kilometers, or 3 depending on which ships you're comparing. However, the consumable action time on this radar is 20 seconds. So you only have 20 seconds of radar versus the anywhere from 40 to close to a minute, depending on what you put on the ship in terms of mods and what have you, in terms of radar. So you could have a almost 1 minute long 10 kilometer or 9 kilometer radar versus I think it's something like 28 or 29 seconds 12 kilometer radar on the Chapiev, the Donskoy, the Nevsky. Okay, this is the light cruiser line. Now that being said, let's go look at the Tallinn or Tallinn. 12-kilometer radar, but 15 seconds of radar is all you get. I think you can get that up to 19, again, with mods and what have you. That is something to think about here. You have long-range radar on the Soviet cruisers, but it's not particularly long. So if you're going to radar, you need to think about things like looking at your mini-map, seeing where your friendly ships are, your teammates, if they're going to have line of sight or be able to shoot at whatever you radar. These are things you have to think about, because if you radar and nobody's around you, only you know where that there's a target there, which at the end of the day may be what you're looking for, but your goal should be trying to focus on getting a win. So you want to help your team get that win as much as you can. Chapiev, Donskoy, Nevsky are technically light cruisers, right? The Tallinn, the Riga, and the Petropavlovsk are considered the heavy cruisers. The difference between these two lines, and realistically the light cruiser line all the way up, Budyoni and Shores, there could be an argument that they're a heavy cruiser because of the caliber of their guns. These are still technically light cruisers because they are very lightly armored, very easy to make go away if they are at the wrong angle, so just keep that in mind. The Chapiev and Donskoy have fairly good anti-aircraft capability. The Donskoy, I will tell you, at tier 9, if you build her out as a double rudder shift cruiser, can be very hazardous to the enemy. She can conversely be very squishy to the enemy if not driven correctly. The Nevsky has had buffs recently. She essentially has what we call the Necro heal, where she can come back from being very low damage. She repairs back significant amounts of Citadel damage. We'll go into what a Citadel is later on in a future video when I go over the basics of World of Warships. I did one of these about 4 years ago, and we're going to do new ones to try to update a lot of this information. Plus, it's poor quality, so hopefully it'll look fairly good. The split off of the shores going to the Tallinn, the Riga, and the Petra. These are the Soviet heavy cruisers. These are higher caliber guns, which have some of the best penetrating AP in the game, some of the best dispersion. For the longest time, the Petropavlovsk was a ship that the community did not enjoy fighting against because they for all intents and purposes, were broken. They were far, far, far overperforming when it came to cruisers in general. The Petropavlovsk was essentially a battle cruiser. She has had some balancing changes recently in the past year or so. I think that's kind of reined her in, kind of balanced her out. She is now at a point where she can still be very strong in the hands of a good ship driver, but you still need to have a little bit of skill to do well in her, right? We get to the Soviet destroyer line. These are ships that typically have shorter torpedo ranges. That means that these are meant to be gunboats. However, those short torpedo ranges do hit pretty hard. So whatever you're torping at typically point blank ranges is going to get hurt pretty bad. Now, two lines, one going to the Zorkiev, one going to Grozvoy, okay? What are the differences between these two? I will tell you, the Tashkent is probably one of the better tier 9 destroyers in the game for running gunning. She has pretty good range torps, a good gun range. At tier 8, and even the Minsk, pretty well balanced destroyers in terms of guns and torpedoes, not necessarily performance. Running and gunning, both of these lines essentially do it. I will tell you, recently the Grozvoy got buffs to both her torpedoes. I do not see a reason to go to the Delny and play the Delny other than to unlock the Zorkiev, okay? Grozvoy does everything the Delny does, and it does it even better, in my opinion. That's just my opinion, but I will tell you, the Delny is not particularly the greatest destroyer in the game currently in terms of running and gunning. The Grozvoy just does everything better. The Zorkiev is fun as a destroyer main. I have fun in her. But yeah, these are meant to be run and gun destroyers. Not meant to technically be capping because of the fact that they are run and gun destroyers. You can get yourself in a lot of trouble if you get spotted in a cap early. These destroyers should probably be played after you've kind of grasped the concept of destroyer play in general. Very fast, good at running down other destroyers, okay? The Soviet carrier line. This is a carrier line that if you get good in CVs, you will upset the enemy team on a regular basis. There are not a whole lot of downsides to the Soviet carrier. If you know not to sit stationary in your carrier and you know how to position your ordnance going at a target, you're going to deal consistent damage throughout the entirety of a battle. Her aircraft are a little bit squishy, but that's negated because of the longer range of ordnance going to the target. And you may have a flight, whereas like in a midway you may have multiple attacks, or the ability to do multiple attacks for the squadron. The Soviets, after every single drop, you're going back to the carrier to grab another strike and send it out, which is, in my opinion, a plus, not a negative, because you constantly can be sending aircraft downrange. Again, this carriers should probably be the last class that you play. You're going to hear me say that a lot. Germany. Okay. We're going to spend probably a little bit more time on the German tech tree than the rest of the lines. Why? This video is meant for newer players coming to the game. The German ships in general, with the exception of one line here in the tech tree, are probably some of the most forgiving ships that also have the ability to regularly put out damage on a pretty constant level. Okay, you're going to see 2 battleship lines, you're going to see a cruiser line, 2 destroyer lines, and a carrier line. The differences between the Schlieffen line and the Prussian line are pretty stark. The Schlieffen line is meant to be a little bit higher speed, okay, battle cruisers that, I will tell you, even starting at the Heinrich, can be amazing flank pushers if you have support. Even without support, they do fairly well. Fairly long range secondaries, fairly good punchy guns, fairly long range torpedoes, as well as hydro that detects torpedoes and enemy destroyers. These battleships, if you figure out how to play the other battleship line fairly well, will be very easy for you to learn how to play. They are, however, fairly squishy comparative to other battleships. You have to be careful. That's why I call them battle cruisers. But if you're a good battleship player, they can be devastating in the hands of, in your hands rather. Going from the Nassau down to the Prussian, these battleships are meant to be essentially floating tanks. They have pretty good hit point pools, pretty good armor. They have what's called a turtleback, which means your citadel, which is where in real life the important parts of the ship would be sitting in an armored coffin inside the ship, right? Your ammunition and engineering spaces would be encapsulated in this citadel armor. These German battleships are the epitome of what's meant to be a tank. If you have support, these can also be really good flank pushers, because you can grab the attention of the entire enemy team on that flank and continue to push, and they can shoot at you and you can tank that damage fairly well. Okay, again, starting at Bismarck, you have hydro, which will allow you to detect torpedoes. You have fairly good secondaries, honestly, starting at tier 6 in this line. However, the guns are not exactly accurate. What that means is you're going to fire a lot of ordnance at targets downrange at even say 10 kilometers and you may completely miss. but this is compensated specifically in the Prussian with the reload. The reload of the guns is fairly good. If you learn the kind of standard dispersion pattern that you get with these German battleships and you get into mid ranges anywhere from 10 to 15 kilometers, they can actually put out some very good damage. You are going to take damage. This should be something you're not afraid of, though, when you play a battleship, because you have a repair party, which means you have the ability to regenerate some of those hit points back. Okay. The Prussian line battleships specifically should not be played as backline snipers. This is very important that you recognize this. They are meant to be frontline battleships. They are meant to be the ones that are actually pushing toward the enemy, assuming you have support again, and tanking so that your team can take advantage of the fact that you have the attention of the enemy and move in with you. Okay. German cruisers are some of, in my opinion, the best cruisers in the game. They have some of the best performing guns, best armor, and speed and maneuverability even. They are not, let's jump into German cruisers or we're going to win, but they are ships that, if you make a mistake, especially starting at the hipper, they could slough off some of the damage being thrown their way. That being said, at the York all the way up to Hermelin, they're pretty light cruisers, so you have to be careful, but the guns are pretty good. I have seen some Nuremberg and York players put out significant damage because they stayed at long range and they kept playing with their throttles and their rudder, and the enemy just couldn't hit them. And this is great. At the higher tiers, the Rune and the Hindenburg are some of probably the best long-range kiters, meaning you sit back, I would say in some instances, behind the battleships, raining fire on the enemy, to the point where the enemy may ignore your battleships and start shooting at you. This is a good thing, because the Hindenburg has a kind of a nickname. Some people call it the Battleship Hindenburg because she has very good armor, very good guns. It's just an all-around good tier 10. So again, I can't say this enough. If you're new to the game, play the German ships because they are probably some of the most forgiving and best ships to learn mechanics with. The German destroyers going up to the Z-52, we're going to call this a light destroyer line because I'm going to call the Elbing a heavy destroyer line, okay? The light destroyer line has mediocre, if not low, I shouldn't say low, not the best concealment, but it has some of the better guns as well as fastest reloading torps, but not the best range torps. Starting, I think, at the Gade, I might be incorrect. I have to double check right now, actually, because there was recent changes. So, excuse me, the V22, right? The V170 doesn't have it. This is one of the lowest tiers that you get hydro on a destroyer. Tier 5, you can have hydroacoustic search, meaning you could spot torpedoes faster as well as ships in smoke. These are some of the destroyers that are the most menacing in the hands of a good destroyer driver, because in the hands of a good destroyer driver, they can be hunter killers for other destroyers, very effective. So it's just something to think about there. The AA is not that bad. The guns are not that bad. Again, the torp reload is fairly quick. They don't have the highest damage torps, but the reload on the torps is pretty good. Now, for the heavy destroyer line, or as you'll hear me sometimes refer to it on my streams as the ultralight cruisers, Z-31, Merker, Schultz, and Elbing, these destroyers are not meant to be hunting other destroyers. These are meant to be harassing and engaging cruisers. They have higher caliber guns that have very good AP that does very good damage against cruisers and battleships. That being said, if you hit other destroyers with the HE from these guns, you're going to do pretty good damage, but the rate of fire is fairly low comparatively, so you have to pick your fights very carefully. German carriers. This line can be one of the most trolly lines out there. They have armor piercing rockets versus HE rockets, which is essentially every line that we've covered thus far has only high explosive rockets. They have armor piercing bombs versus HE bombs and pretty good torpedoes. You can also build the Percival or Richthofen for full secondaries if you wanted to, which is quite a meme build, but most carrier drivers are going to build them for the aircraft specifically, which is what you want to focus on, in my opinion. On to the UK, the Royal Navy. Here you're going to see right now, because the Royal Navy battle cruisers are in early access, they're going to be yellow. Later on, these will turn to white, just like the rest of the tech tree. Again, 2 battleship lines, 2 cruiser lines, a destroyer line, and a carrier line, okay? Let's get into the Royal Navy battle cruisers. Okay, this line being in early access means that these ships are still being learned. People are still learning how to play them and counter them. These ships are pretty fun. They're pretty fast. Their guns are pretty punchy. They have fairly decent armor. That doesn't mean they're impervious to gunfire, but they have pretty good armor. So even calling them battle cruisers isn't necessarily fair. They can hang against other battleships. And they have higher caliber guns. I think starting at the Duncan, you have 16.5-inch guns, which are pretty good guns for the tier in general. They also have some very unique torpedoes on them. So if you have one of these ships facing you and you're fairly close, within 10 kilometers, their nose is facing you, you should probably expect torpedoes to be coming your way. These torpedoes are very high damage, but they're very low in terms of the number of them. So case in point, the Duncan can only fire 1 off of each side of the bow. So you get 1 torpedo that comes towards you. And if they hit you, they can do as much as 29,000 damage. It's very high damage for battleship launched torps. And pretty good range at 10 kilometers. So I will tell you, these battleships in game right now are pretty trolly because you catch people off guard. Okay. The other battleship line going down to the Conqueror. These are battleships that, if you're spamming nothing but HE throughout the entirety of a battle, you cannot complain, because they have pretty high caliber guns that have pretty high fire chance. These are guns that are going to do pretty good amounts of damage with HE. Starting at the Lion and Conqueror, you have what is, you'll hear me refer to it as the Necro repair party. Essentially a repair party that's going to repair back Citadel damage, okay? Repair party on battleships will repair back 100% fire damage. So if you get caught on fire, you could just let it burn, and when your repair party comes up, you can heal back 100% of that damage, assuming you're not taking other damage. This will be covered more in other videos, okay? Conqueror, Lion, Monarch, KGV, or King George V, you're gonna see pretty punchy guns for the caliber, pretty good AP. So you don't want to just ignore it, but the HE is pretty good as well. Queen Elizabeth, Iron Duke, Orion, Bellerophon, are pretty good battleships as well. However, I think where they lack is they're fairly slow, and their turret rotation is very slow. Okay, let's look at the Royal Navy cruisers. You have 2 lines: light cruiser, heavy cruiser. Again, these cruisers are stark differences in terms of how they play. The Royal Navy light cruisers, starting at the Edinburgh, you could take the smoke off and put radar on if you want. So these can become radar cruisers. However, they are some of the squishiest cruisers in the game. So you have to be very good at your placement and knowing the enemy in order to survive shots coming at you. I usually tell people, unless you're very confident in your light cruiser play, keep the smoke. Very high rate of fire. Before there was semi-armor piercing shells in the game, the AP on the Royal Navy light cruisers was referred to as semi-armor piercing. They were armor-piercing shells that had reduced armor-piercing capabilities. What that means is you're going to tend to do more damage to destroyers and cruisers and less damage to battleships. Okay, you also have the necro heal, meaning you'll hear people say I'm reprinting my ship. Okay, and you'll look at the, I think it starts here. It does. The Edinburgh, you'll see specialized repair teams, right? Versus if I go to, say, the Fiji, is it the Fiji that has it? You have standard repair party. So you see the difference here. HP per second, 137 hit points per second for 28 seconds. Now, if I go back to the Edinburgh, you're going to see 636 hit points being regenerated for 20 seconds. That's quite significant. Along with this, they are also going to regenerate Citadel damage. Sorry, I had Hot Rod on this ship and he just decided to play his animation. Edinburgh, Neptune, Minotaur, some of the funnest. I call them large destroyers because that's essentially what they are destroyers with citadels. Very fun ships to play. Very good AA, very good hydro, pretty good torpedoes, pretty high rate fire, longer range guns. However, the balancing act is they could easily be one shot by battleships if placed incorrectly. The Royal Navy large cruisers. These cruisers have pretty high caliber guns with the, let me try to get into the equipment here, with the necro repair party, but you can also shoot HE and AP. These are very good ships for running and gunning and constantly starting fires. I will tell you, all of these, if their HE shells hit destroyers, will do pretty darn good damage. That being said, up to the Albemarle, your armor is not great. Okay, so you will take significant damage. You have to be careful with your placement. The Albemarle, Drake, and Goliath all have okay armor, but they all have the necro heal, so you can repair back a lot of that citadel damage that battleships may place on you. The Royal Navy destroyers are probably some of the better destroyers in the game. Their smoke consumable, however, lasts some of the shortest time lengths of any destroyer in the game, and it's typically meant to deal a bit of damage or just get away. Okay, they have hydro. Pretty good hydro that lasts fairly long, but it isn't particularly long range. I think 3 kilometers is about the max range for the higher tiers that you're going to detect. At tier 8, the Lightning is probably one of the best destroyers in the game. The guns slap other destroyers pretty high damage amounts comparatively tier to tier. These destroyers can be very fun. Again, I would suggest you play these last before carriers, after you learn how to play battleships and cruisers some. The Royal Navy carriers are not particularly great at any one thing, unfortunately. Their torpedoes, their rockets, their bombs are all kind of meh, in my opinion, in terms of damage. They do a carpet bomb, which actually is pretty good, okay, for covering a larger area of bombs. This is not typically something you're going to see high-performing players play. Maybe when they get the Audacious they will because of the torpedoes and bombs, but typically you won't see too many Royal Navy carriers in battle because of this. The French pretty much battleship, cruiser, destroyer have some of the faster ships in the game. These are meant to be pretty fast, pretty good run and gun ships. The battleships don't start with their speed until you get to about the Normandy at tier 6. Okay, they have some of the best armor piercing shells in the game. They have some of the better AA in the game, with the exception of the destroyer line. You're going to see these battleships being essentially played as high-speed, low-drag, engagement ships. They're really good at that. Up to the, starting at the Alsace and even the Richelieu, you can have some pretty good secondaries if you do a secondary build. Alsace Republique, pretty good secondaries. They have 152s, which are pretty high caliber secondaries. Don't necessarily need to have these as secondary builds, but the AP on these battleships is very good. Armor piercing, by the way, if you don't know what AP is. The French cruisers, some of the best cruisers in the game for kiting a flank, running and gunning. Again, very long range, very high speed, very good HE fire chance. They also have main battery reload, which reduces how long the main battery takes to reload. These cruisers, and for the longest time, the Henri IV was considered one of the most broken cruisers because of her damage potential and her ability to play with their throttles. They also have speed boost, which is amazing to get away from a flank or switch flanks if needed. The Cherbourg, Brest, and Marseille, these are new lines that just released out of early access with the last patch. They have pretty good, punchy, battle cruiser-like tendencies, not the greatest armor, pretty high caliber guns, pretty good secondary armament, pretty good AA. Again, I wouldn't necessarily build these as secondary builds unless you're confident in your gameplay, but very fast, good for flank shifting and helping if needed on another flank. The French destroyers, this was the first destroyer line that had no smoke. For the longest time, people were saying this will not work. However, these can be some of the most fun destroyers in the game if you get good at running and gunning. Very, very, very good for flank switching or engaging and running down lower health enemy destroyers. They also have main battery reload boosters starting about the mid to late tiers. I think that's where this starts right here. So you see no smoke for any of these. The AP on these destroyers, though low caliber guns, can do pretty darn good amounts of damage to broadside destroyers and cruisers, not something to ignore. You see there's no carrier line here, so we move on. The Italian ships. These ships have probably some of the worst, the battleships have some of the worst dispersion of any battleship in the game. However, they tend to have pretty good shell for shell damage because they have semi-true semi-armor piercing shells in the game, what are actually called SAP shells in the game. You have the ability, it's versus HE, so you're gonna have AP and SAP. Okay, to be honest with you, this line, you could fire SAP the entire time and be perfectly fine, so long as you're shooting at the appropriate parts of the ship. Superstructure or broadside targets, in other words. These battleships also have a full speed smoke that you could run maximum throttle with smoke and use that to push in or pull away from a flank. I believe that starts at tier 8. Like, if I can double check here. Yes, I do believe I'm correct with that. Let me go here. Yep, this is full speed smoke, which means at full speed these battleships will run in smoke and stay concealed, assuming you don't fire your main battery. Okay, the Italian cruiser line, these are heavy cruisers, but realistically starting probably, I would even beg to say, at the Brindisi, just because these are cruisers that are high speed, low drag. They are thinner cruisers. The caliber of their guns, however, is what they classified these as heavy cruisers for. They have smoke, high speed, full speed smoke, pretty long range torpedoes. That doesn't mean you need to use them, by the way, but they're slower torpedoes for because of the fact that they're cruisers, so they should be main batteries what you're focusing. These destroyers, or these cruisers, are very good at killing enemy destroyers. Very good at it. Very good at chunk damage in battleship superstructure. Very good at taking out other cruisers. These cruisers are probably some of the better cruisers in the game, especially if you like the idea of ambushing ships, because their concealment's not particularly bad. Italian destroyers. So this destroyer line was 2 patches ago, I believe, at this point. People are still learning how to play these pretty fast. They have short duration speed boost. They have SAP and HE, so semi-armor piercing and high explosive. Pretty long range torpedoes. These are pretty good ships for ambushing other destroyers or YOLO pushing battleships that might be low health. I will tell you, if you're a skilled destroyer player, these probably will suit you. They have a higher skill cap to have sustained superior performance, in my opinion. Pan-Asian cruisers and destroyers. So the Pan-Asian destroyer line is essentially a mix-up of Royal Navy destroyers and American destroyers. I don't think there's any other destroyers in this line that aren't from those two nations. Somebody in the comments could probably correct me on that, but for the most part, these destroyers are copies of American and Royal Navy ships. So case in point, the Yu Yang is a Gearing, Chungmu is a Fletcher, Hsien Yang's a Benson, and so on and so forth. Their guns have a little bit higher fire chance than the US guns, especially if you have the premium commanders in them. Their torpedoes, however, are deep waters, meaning they can't hit other destroyers. They're only going to hit cruisers and up. And they have, as a result of that, significantly less you're going to spot the torp significantly shorter distance between you and the torpedo than you would other nations. So the argument for these destroyers could be that they're meant to be torp boats. Recently, they added in a torp reload booster to some of these ships, which has made them pretty viable. The Yu Yang, Chungmu, and Hsien Yang, if I remember correctly, they're also pretty fast for destroyers. However, they still have the underperforming guns of the American caliber at the higher tiers, in my opinion. Pretty fun destroyers. The smoke, usually you have the ability to lay a pretty long line of smoke, but it doesn't last particularly long. The Pan-Asian cruisers, these are essentially not the best cruisers in the game overall, in my opinion, until you get to tier 10, unfortunately. All of these cruisers have just enough gun range to get you to the point where you're going to get yourself in trouble against enemy battleships and possibly one shot. These are a mixture, I believe, of Royal Navy, American, and I think a Russian cruiser, essentially, that are rerolls. They have deep water torps as well that are long range. Case in point, the Jin Yang. You have the ability to drop 20 torpedoes into the water that go out to 13.5 kilometers and then hit a main battery reload booster or torpedo reload booster and do it all again, all within approximately 40 seconds. So you can have 40 torpedoes in the water heading out toward the enemy that are only going to hit cruisers, battleships, and carriers. This is very good if your team is trying to retreat from a flank and you have battleships in pursuit and you're able to stay concealed and dump all these torpedoes ahead of their push because they're going to drive into them. I will tell you, pretty good AA, pretty good concealment. However, like I said, until the tier 9 or tier 10, these ships are kind of a ship that you have to have a higher skill base to do well in. The EU destroyers, these can be some of the most fun destroyers to play in the game, in my opinion. Okay, these destroyers have no smoke. They have pretty long-range torpedoes that are lower damage, pretty fast reload, however, not bad guns, and pretty good AA starting about tier 7. Okay, these destroyers, I will tell you, you probably shouldn't hop into early in the game, though. You need to learn the basic mechanics. In the hands of a even mediocre destroyer driver, these ships can do very well, especially the Olin, Ostergotland, and Holland. They are meant to be torp boats, however. My suggestion, they don't have the DPS, the amount of guns that other destroyers have. The guns are meant to be used in a case of you just come around a corner and there's another destroyer. They can put out a lot of damage as a result of that, but the torpedoes should be the primary focus of this line. Dutch cruisers, these are a mixture These are essentially large or battle cruisers, specifically starting at the Harlem and going down. Light cruisers from the Endrak up. When you start looking at the Johann de Witt and the Golden Lou, it actually looks like a Royal Navy battleship and a German battleship had a love child and spit out the Golden Lou. You'll see it in the superstructure layout, the gun layout. It looks very similar to that. The guns on them are okay. The AA on these is very good, but they have a gimmick where you can call in a carpet bomb for a specific area, an airstrike, if you will. And if there's a ship that you know is parked behind an island, it is very good at dislodging those ships, because these bombs do massive damage with a very high fire chance if you catch them with multiple bombs. These cruisers overall probably are going to see a buff in the future because they just aren't great, and you don't see a lot of people running to these ships. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's essentially what it is. And long story longer, at an hour later, we're finally done with the nation breakdown. There is the Commonwealth here. However, there's no tech tree line. That's what I'm focusing on. Maybe in the future we'll look at some premium ships. But I've had people ask me what's a good tech tree line to go down, or what's the difference between them. I know this video was extremely long, and I really sincerely apologize for that. At any point, you can ask questions in the comments down below. DM me on Discord, which I will put up on the screen for my personal Discord after the video, or pop into my streams anytime I'm streaming World of Warships on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/Happa_fodder at typically 2 p.m. Central until 7 p.m. Central. That's pretty normal for me. And yeah, if you have any questions, comments, and concerns, definitely please leave those down below. I will try to answer as many as I can, or create videos in the future. This video is probably longer than what I'm trying to do in the future, and I apologize for that. Hopefully we will see one video a week, approximately 30 to 40 minutes at max. I appreciate the hell out of every single one of you. As always, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, laugh, smile, make someone else laugh and smile, and we will see you guys next time.